Good afternoon, everybody. Usually when I speak at conferences, I've been here during the day and heard what's happened beforehand, and today is the first time that I haven't been in that situation, so bear with me, and hopefully what I say will fit in with the kind of discussions that you've already had today. For me, I'm recently joined the National Advocacy Service in February of this year, and when the National Advocacy Service got set up under a new board from the 1st of June. So for me it's quite strange because I'm here with Helen Lahart, who's been with the National Advocacy Service, and Marita Woods for many, many years, and Rachel. So it seems strange that I'm talking about the service rather than them. So they can correct me if I get things wrong.
They keep you on your toes.
They will, which is good. So when Martin asked me to speak today, he asked me to touch on a number of things. One was, where did the impetus for the National Advocacy Service come from? What is the role of the service today? So what does the National Advocacy Service do? And what is important in training for leaders and families? And particularly he asked me there to link in with some of my previous background. So before I joined the National Advocacy Service, I worked for the National Federation of Voluntary Bodies. And I'd also have undertaken the background work, but still a bit of writing to finish on my PhD, looking at the implementation of the UN Convention. And as part of that, I travelled in New Zealand, the US and China. So I'll be weaving little bits of those stories into what I'm talking about. And finally, he asked, how can the National Advocacy Service come together with organisations like ATB and other groups to promote inclusion and equality? So I think some of the discussions that we're having internally at the moment will maybe resonate with those points. So to start with the background pieces, if I can make this work, yes. I didn't make the slides, I didn't know they did these freely things. So I think we all know the sort of longer background of the campaign of looking for change and looking to see how we can implement change. From the perspective of the National Advocacy Service, that officially got started in 2004 when the Citizens Information Board became engaged with the community and voluntary sector in order to develop advocacy provision. And as a consequence of that, in 2005-2006, they sought expressions of interest in relation to setting up advocacy pilot projects around the country. And maybe many of you are familiar with those projects that happened and their various forms. So there are about 46 really diverse projects looking at different kinds of advocacy. In 2010, then, an evaluation report was undertaken, and it was decided to change that format of the National Advocacy Service into a new format. So the service was then set up under 5 citizens' information boards who had expressed an interest of wanting to support the development of advocacy around the country. And so it moved into its 3rd stage this year in the 1st of June, when I mentioned that it came under one new national board and was set up as one organisation, one company. So all of the staff transferred into that new company, and there were approximately between 45 to 50 of us involved in the organisation at this stage. I'm not going to go into all of the details on the slides, but just hit the key headlines, so that I can keep to time. The middle part of this hasn't come up, there it is. So when we changed under the new structure on the 1st of June, we had to change the regions. Some of you may have been familiar with the regions as they were set up previously. So we now have 4 regions, and you can see them in the colours. So we have red is the Greater Dublin, so that's Dublin, Wicklow and Fingal. The North East and Midlands then goes across to Athlone, slightly down below that motorway line, and then up above to the border counties. And then the Western region, which stretches from Donegal to Limerick, and the Southern region that stretches from Killarney and Cork across to Wexford. This was a big debate to see how could we ensure that we had representation across the country that meant that people would have as equal access to the service as possible. So one of the things that we looked at was the distribution of people with disabilities, those of us across the country, to see where might we make sure that the service would be able to provide the best equal access. And we also looked at a range of other factors, including congregated settings. So we looked at the congregated settings report to see where were people who were going to need to move from the living arrangements that they were in. So to give you an update where we are right now, so as of November 10th, there are 525 people being supported by the National Advocacy Service. And the kind of supports that people are having vary quite a bit. I know this slide is hard to read, but just to give you a little bit of an idea of, this is focusing more on ensuring people's will and preferences are heard, inclusion and representation in decision-making processes, making decisions, exploring options, information provision, self-advocacy support and coaching, research and preparation, accessing rights to entitlements, making a complaint, and then two other areas. So involved in a very wide range of activity to support people in the issues that people are coming forward with. We do have a national number, which was on one of the earlier slides, and I will make available. So the easiest way to contact the service is through that national number, and that operates 5 days a week. And usually, the majority of the time, you'll get directly through to one of the administrators or advocates, and who will link you up with the advocate in your region. So just maybe to mention on the map that I showed you, all of the advocates that I've mentioned are placed by county. So we have an advocate in almost every county, bar a few counties. Louth and Offaly and Longford are the two who don't have an advocate actually working in that county, but you can access an advocate even if you live in those two counties from neighbouring counties. So there is a presence. In Dublin there are 3 bases for where the advocates are based, and in Galway and Cork there are a number of people based together, but other than that there is somebody in every county. So we've recently been talking about, as we get to one service, how are we going to work together, and on the 4th and 5th of November we had the first national discussions around that, and I think that hits possibly on some of the issues that you may have been talking about earlier. So we started talking about the implication of what model of disability we operate in has an impact on what advocacy issues we identify, how we might work and what we might write, and how we represent people, what meetings we might attend, and I'll come back to the meetings bit in particular. So we looked about the history of the move from the medical model focusing on needs to the social model that focuses on barriers and discrimination, and particularly the move towards rights and focusing on the right to an ordinary life and a right to choose where I live. In relation to some of the debates that we've had have been about where do decisions about people's lives get made. In many of the advocates are asked to attend multidisciplinary meetings. So we're starting having a discussion about, is that a place where we should be, or should we only be in meetings that are set up by the person, for the person, with the people that they want there. So there are big questions in relation to how we work in relation to the kinds of situations that we get invited into, and how can we change the kind of places that decisions get made. In one of my previous roles, I would have set up the Immersion project that looked at how to develop individualised, personalised supports, focusing more on people with intellectual disability, but I think it has many parallels around the individualising of supports that the Centre for Independent Living and AT have been focusing on. So, and in that we were looking at, how do you free up the funding from the traditional service providers to move away, and how do you move away from some of the thinking that goes with that? So we were very much focusing on how to support an ordinary life, and that services need to understand the move away from service land thinking of fitting into the programs that exist, rather than trying to develop the supports around the person in the way that they want them. But I think one of the things that I think is quite different in relation to AT in the Centre of Independent Living is when you're not trying to change an existing organisation that's kind of set in its way, but you can carve a new place and a new way of supporting people and offering them the kind of support that they'd like to have. Resources are predominantly tied up in the older styles, and I think that we really need to see the assessment of need coming forward, much as I have difficulty with the language of it and the terms, but that mechanism that's going to allow individualised budgets, that then we can get into more details around individual planning. But at the same time, I don't think that we need to wait for individualised budgets in order to have individualised supports. I think that we have to be asking and demanding for them to be there, and that we've seen lots of examples where that's actually happening. So we need to build on those opportunities. The new challenge for the National Advocacy Service is around supporting people in individualised budgets and looking at the brokerage model. So we're trying to think and prepare in relation to that about how can we step up our role in that area to make sure that we are active and aware, so that while we're directed by the person, we're making sure that we do the exploration of options with the person, or making sure that that's happening for them in some other place, so that they can explore not just what has always been there, but what could be there. And we're looking at those actions at individual, systemic and strategic levels. We also looked at the whole changes that are coming with the assisted decision-making bill and how we can look at developing supporting decision-making. So endorsing and skilling up on the will and preferences of people. How do we do that, particularly in complex situations, in a way that is robust, that we can stand over? So in that way that we're supporting the legal capacity of people to be involved in the decisions around themselves. One of the key focuses of my PhD has been on Article 12 and the whole focus on legal capacity. So this slide I could probably talk about all day, but I'm not allowed. So I'm going to have to pass on that, but do feel free to come back to me on it at a later point. We're also looking at in relation to the decision-making process, how advocacy can be the least restrictive alternative. But it's very detailed and work that takes good time and intention and needs to be very carefully done. And we think that one of the areas where we may have to work is particularly around the challenging around capacity assessments, particularly the discriminating nature of them, and how they aim to sort of create different decisions for people. So in that discussion around kind of marrying those two people together, we were talking about how people always communicate, the power of labels and the need for us to be very careful for that. In the discussion we had Sally Warren from the UK who was talking about work that she's doing with John O'Brien at the moment on healing integrity gaps. Looking at the gap between what organisations often say they will do and what they actually do, and how do we get those better aligned. But as I say, in a situation, the CIL and AT, where it's creating its own, that same issue isn't there, I think, to the same extent. But including in that the general desire to support freedom to live an ordinary life, seeing and believing in people's capacity, the mindfulness and decision making, and making sure that that disconnect isn't there, and the risk of trying to be different. And that looks at people, staff and cultures. In particular, I think we have to really unpack the whole duty of care that is used to undermine autonomy in so many areas. If it's not duty of care, it's health and safety. So I think those are two of the things that we have to stay very careful and vigilant about. And the importance of the dignity at risk. But that doesn't mean abandon to risks. It's not about risk at any level, but about supporting people to take the risks, because that's where we all learn. We learn from risks and we learn from mistakes, which I know very well. So the actions that we're looking at continuing the one-to-one representative advocacy that the National Advocacy Service does, the importance of our independence in that role. Looking at systemic and strategic levels that we need to work, so particularly working with the National Advisory Group and the regional advisory groups, where lots of groups like CIL, DFI and other groups have connected with us. The National looking at the national structure to gather recurring issues and feeding into social policy issues. So we will be looking stronger at those areas. And I think the importance in our work, we're talking about the need to work with allies and networks. So, for example, that example I gave of somebody going into a multidisciplinary team, one of the situations that one of the young advocates came back with was a situation where somebody had been part of the immersion project that I mentioned and part of the enabling excellence training, focusing on individualised supports. And that key worker brought in the advocate to help. So you had the start of kind of growing allies in a meeting about making sure that resources got directed in the right way. In relation to my PhD and the placement I was in the disability, it's called DREDF, the Disability Rights Education Defence Fund in Berkeley, which is the home of the Centre of Independent Living, and the people there had been really strong advocates around particularly trying to take class action cases to make change. But one of the things that was happening while I was in the States was that they were looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act and the kind of amendments that they needed to make on it. So I was based in California. The main decision-making hub people would see largely as Washington. But I have never seen anything like the conference calls and the way things worked as that whole development around the ADA was happening. So all of the disability groups around the country came together. They had really strident phone calls around what the position of the disability community would be in relation to the different amendments that were being proposed and the kind of work that they were going to do. So what they managed to do in a country much bigger than ours, if you take the population of California alone is 36 million, so a population of over 350 million, the disability community managed to come together to find one position on some of the proposals and changes that were put forward. And they're very strong about having one position externally, so you can fight it out inside, but when you go to government and when you go to work with other groups, you keep that one position and hold it strong and clear. And it was a hugely powerful process to see happening. One of the other things that they did is they paid great attention to leadership. So one of the conversations that Martin and I had after I came back was around a youth leadership program that they developed in California of supporting young people with disability, and they were targeting people in the age group of 16 to 18 to be leaders, to be in those positions, to kind of take leadership places and to change things in the future. And that again was really, really important. Within New Zealand, the way that they worked with it is that they worked very, very closely with government. So the civil service structure was different to what we have here in that they had people who had worked outside of the civil service who were now working in it. So rather than people who had been career civil servants. And to me that made a very big difference of people who had that other understanding. They also developed a very strong partnership with the Disability Assembly there. And so they lived the nothing about us without us in a very true and detailed way. So when they were making policy changes and when they were making decisions, they did that in partnership. And they brought that partnership into the drafting of the UN Convention. So New Zealand feels they own that bit of the convention, of making sure that when the convention was drafted, it was drafted with people with disabilities rather than people at a remove within the UN system. So I think there are lots of lessons for us to look at how we work together and to develop our networks and alliances about strengthening our voice in terms of moving forward. And I think sort of those allies and networks are at that individual level. So I think Helen is going to be talking more about the circles of support locally within our communities and making sure that we make the connections there and bring support with us, and also nationally within ourselves and with allied groups and others. If I was to sum up my studies, then I would summarise it in the next two slides. So when I was looking at the convention, was looking at all the different rights that are held within it. So looking at the rights of liberty and freedom of movement, basic social rights, the right to education, to housing, participation rights, the rights that include access and making sure that we can move freely in the way that we want, personal autonomy rights, that right to dignity and autonomy in the kind of decisions we make and the choices that are available, and equality rights. And lastly, but not least, protective rights. I think the experience of people with disabilities, and perhaps particularly people with intellectual disabilities, is that the protective rights have overtaken lots of other rights. So it's been protective rights at the expense of the other rights. And what my point is, that it's protection of all rights, not just the right to protection, because it's in that wider protection and protecting autonomy and our right to choose and our right to live the way that we want to live is at the heart of what we're here to be doing. So, thank you. I hope I've kept to time.
Fantastically.